Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Keith Preston, Terminal Philosophy, and Swithin Dobson. So today's discussion is a video that we all watched ahead of time by the YouTube channel What If Alt Hist, which is a fairly large channel. It's about 500,000 subscribers. This guy got started doing just speculating about alternative histories, things like, what if the Allies after World War II invaded the Soviet Union, like what Patton wanted to do, so on and so forth. But he's sort of grown into this more analytical, current events, sociological take. And he does that on a lot of issues. And the issue today is civil strife in America. The video is entitled, "Who Will Win America's Next Civil War?" So that I thought that he had a lot of interesting insights and takes on this. Now, again, I don't always agree with what he says, and I don't think the whole panel will agree with everything, but he's at least serious, right? He's putting in the effort to study and look at the materials to come up with some sort of a answer. The one thing that he likes to do a lot, and we see this in the first part of the video, is like looking at these periodizations with the 80-year crisis. Every 80 years is a crisis, and then there's some sort of like epicycles of history. I mean, on the one hand, I think that there could be some arguments for that, but I think it's a little too formulaic. It's almost like you have this formula that you're trying to find things to fit into rather than having the things to fit into it. But because again, everybody's like, that was it, the 80-year rule. So it's like, well, 2020 is coming around. Is going to be the next big thing, whether it's, in the 1940s, it was World War II. In the 1860s, it was the Civil War. I mean, maybe. But, again, I think that's just seeing patterns and making a little too much of it. But then he goes into the basic theme. He basically treats the right and the left as unified blocks. That's something that I think we're going to get into a little bit more that we don't think is quite that plausible. He makes a few, I think, key insights. The right-left debate is rural versus urban, non-college educated versus college educated. While those are not necessarily perfect overlaps, they broadly describe the nature of each of these factions. And he thinks that, well, the right has all the guns, the right has support from the military, blah, blah, blah. If it did come to that, then the right would have a decisive advantage. But I guess the first thing I want to say, which side would, well, it depends on how this conflict develops. Because, like, what side would the military take, right? I mean, if you look at January 6th, the military was decidedly on the side of Joe Biden and did not in any way give any indication of support for Trump or these protesters. So I guess it's not a given at this point which side the army is going to be on. I think it's more plausible that the army would have a lot of people have a crisis of conscience, and some would side with the establishment and some would side with various rebel factions as it develops. He did point out, I think, an interesting insight as well, that the left thinks it's a lot more powerful than it is. They think that they can just, continually escalate conflict and that it's not going to blow up in their face and that they're going to basically write a check that they can't pay. And he argues that that's partly due to their own ideological conformity. You're on the right side of history. I think also you can argue they live in urban areas predominantly, suburban areas, so they don't really see the world as it really is. I mean, a really good example of this is Kyle Kalinske. One time on Twitter, he had this picture of like farmland as he was looking out the window from an airplane. And he's like, what is this? And I'm like, this guy's presumably going to give us economic policies, but doesn't even know what farmland looks like, which is just sort of like peak, millennial liberal. It's just the way it is. So those are just some of my takes on this right now. But so Keith, what were some of your thoughts on this video?
Yeah, I thought this fellow provided a very good overview of a lot of the core issues that are involved. But I think there are certain things he's leaving out. You mentioned the fact that the dividing line is not just two sides, it's many different sides that have their own interests. And I think that's one problem. I've always thought that if we had another civil war in the United States, it wouldn't be anything like the North-South Civil War from the 1860s. It would be like the Lebanese Civil War of the 1970s. It would be something where you had dozens, if not hundreds, of factions fighting with each other and constantly shifting coalitions and alliances, and the Civil War would assume different characteristics in different geographical regions and things like that. And more recently, we had the Syrian Civil War, and that was a similar type of civil war. And I think that's what another civil war in the United States would be. For one thing, you don't have, well, he did mention that you have the rural urban divide. It's not red states versus blue states as much as rural and urban, but even there, you have plenty of reds in blue zones and plenty of blues and red zones and things like that. So I think that it would be a civil war of that type would be almost like the Yugoslavian Civil War. It would be house to house, street to street, block to block, neighborhood to neighborhood. And again, when it came to the ideological and factional forces, I think it would be kind of like Lebanon. And Lebanon is a small country. It's the size of one of our smaller states and with rough an equivalent population. But in Lebanon in the 70s and 80s, you had a civil war going on with probably 35 or so factions, major factions. And I think that's what the a U.S. civil war in the future would be. It wouldn't be just Republicans versus Democrats and all of that. For one thing, a lot of people, when they do analysis of conflict in America, they leave out groups that aren't part of the standard red-blue divide. A good example of that is what the Marxists would call the urban lumpen proletariat. And we saw that during the riots back in 2020. Like the initial waves of that were largely, not exclusively, but largely black and brown people from the cities, all right, who are really not part of the standard red-blue divide. I mean, like the minorities obviously lean more towards the Democrats, but those tend to be your more middle class minorities. This large urban underclass that we have is not really part of that, and we're growing a white underclass of that type as well. And that's just one example, a couple of examples. There's a lot of factions that aren't in that paradigm. Another thing is I think he discounts the left to a significant degree. I think he underestimates how large the left is, number one, and also the degree of fanaticism that you find in some left circles. For instance, it's not true that social conservatives are this large majority that's being oppressed by this small minority of liberal elites. If you actually look at the data, it shows that that today, even a majority of Republican voters are pro-gay marriage. Like I saw a recent poll that showed even only a minority of Republican voters approve of some of these bills that have been introduced in different states about transgender rights or whatever. So it's not true that social conservatives or cultural conservatives are a large majority. Also, a lot of folks on the left have a religious zeal for their own viewpoint. You see that in some of the levels of fanaticism that they have. And they are becoming increasingly violent and increasingly militant in a lot of different contexts. And that's what you saw in older times. I mean, a lot of the revolutions of the past, you had a situation where something like the Enlightenment or the communism assumed the role of a religion. Another issue was he talks about elites. One thing that he talks about that's interesting is he talks about you have an aspirant elite, that is, people who want to be part of the elite but see their ambitions frustrated. Well, though people with that viewpoint today tend to side with the left, and that's precisely the kind of class that tends to generate revolutions from the left. When you have a middle class, that's largely upwardly mobile, but sees its ambitions frustrated due to entrenchment, various types of institutional entrenchment. Another thing that typically leads to civil wars is when you actually see fragmentation among the ruling class, and we see that as well too. We see a lot of fragmentation going on among the ruling class within the national security apparatus within the corporate financial elite, as well as in the political elite. So these are all the kinds of conditions that often lead to a civil war. The question is just how far is it going to go?
Right. Okay. Swith and Dobson, what are your thoughts on the video?
As you said, I think it's a well-researched and interesting case that he makes. And so for the time being, let's assume there is this sort of like left versus right fight. I think his analysis is pretty good. I mean, it is certainly true that most of the food production, almost all the food production takes place in the rural areas in the center of the country. I also had a look as well. The US produces a lot of its own nitrogen fertilizer, so imports aren't a problem for that. And most of those, they're pretty well distributed across the country, but most of them in the center. Nitrogen fertilizer is essential to getting good crop yields these days. As well, I mean, looking at the energy, again, the US predominant, well, in any war situation, you're going to need reliable energy. So anything like wind turbines and solar panels are going to be pretty darn useless. So you're going to be basing on natural gas and oil and coal. And those are predominantly in the red areas. The coal is up in Illinois, some of the northeast to some extent, but then there's some in the Midwest, a lot in the Midwest as well. Oil, a lot of it is down on the Gulf Coast. Same with the natural gas areas. Now, again, there's fragmentation and there's sort of, it's the sort of could be purple areas, but they're certainly not on the coasts. To a large extent with that kind of production. Same with coal. There is, however, one thing that he missed out in his analysis when it came to sort of the military aspect, is that America produces very little iron ore relative to the amount that it imports. So the US produces each year about 50 million metric tons and imports around at the low end 3,000 million metric tons, most of which comes from China. Now, if you have a protracted conflict and you needed to make steel, well, the Pacific coast is going to be somewhat strategically important, and there's no chance that the right Republican types are going to be, unless, well, strategically, if you're on a first strike, presumably that's where you would try and hold. That would make sense. But it depends. Now, this entirely is going to depend on how much steel there is, how the war would last, or whatever. But I think there was one major thing that he omitted was that you're going to need steel for fighting. Also, I had a look as well. Some of the armament production seem to be pretty well distributed across the country. It is on the coast as well. It is in the center. Steel production, again, there's a decent amount on the coast. A lot of it, again, up in the classic Rust Belt area still is where a lot of it is. As to which ones produce the most, I'm not sure. I didn't go that far. But I think the lack of focus on sort of steel, as it were, I think is an issue with this analysis. But I would agree in type. But again, how that plays out is not obvious. I mean, it is possibly, to a large extent, true that the center could just switch off the electricity and turn the lights off. Yes, that to a large extent seems to be true. And same with food. And they say that the food they can pretty much do self-sufficiently. But steel is the one thing I would have. But I would also agree with Keith. I think the idea that it's just going to be two factions is not true. I also think as well, you've got to take into account economic interests. If the left, even though the sort of ruling elite wouldn't go as far to the left as some of the cultural left do today, they would to a large extent side with them. And if they're the ones who are going to guarantee sort of economic security for many people, then, well, unless it's sufficiently bad and they turn over the tables. But I think you're going to need to have sufficient numbers of people who don't care at this point that they could lose their corporate job. Otherwise, they could all rally together. I mean, and this is in a different situation, but there was a video in Australia of the police basically being a paramilitary group breaking up lockdown protesters and stuff. And the policeman on there said, "No, I agree with you, but it's my job, so I've got to do it, and I'm going to get paid." And it's like, you've got to, that needs to be taken account of. That's also, and then again, as Keith pointed out, the revolutionary class does seem to be historically the upper middle class, as any revolutionary groups. And unless I'm blind, I don't really see a huge amount of sort of MAGA types in the upper middle class who are upperly mobile. So whether or not they would be able to coordinate or get sufficient troops on to do it, I think is unlikely. So those would be my opening thoughts.
Okay, terminal philosophy.
Right. Well, I agree heavily with Keith's point that he tends to underestimate the power and the influence of the left. I think that's one of the major things I'd touch on as well. Now, I think the influence of the political left goes beyond just politics and economics. I think it goes down to all types of various categories of society, whether that's financial or part of the investment class is certainly part of the political left, banking, lending, things like that. And there are also a wide amount of, I should say there's a fair amount of people who are within the bureaucracy that are in all different types of industries like energy or the military or media, journalism. And that could also mean, like in the energy industry as well. And so I think it's important to not frame it as there's a large majority of conservative, just leave me alone, keep the government out of my life, political types versus a small liberal elite. I think the variety of political factions and belligerents in a potential U.S. Second Civil War would look much more varied and colorful rather than red team versus blue team. So that can't be. I don't think that can go overlooked, and that could be its own sort of subject that could go on for several hours. Another thing to consider is that when you begin to consider alternative historical topics, what would a battle map look like, or what would what would a battle map look like? What territory would be controlled by what sides? And I tend to agree that, and I don't know if it was you, Keith, or Todd, who said, there's something like 325 million political parties that go along with it. So maybe that's a thing of the maybe that's an artifact of the modern era or something like that. I think it just goes along with the hyper individualism that is coupled with modern living. So with that being said, I think that there are all types of people. There's all types of factions that would form coalitions, and those coalitions would get they would basically evaporate in an instant when circumstances changed for a set of them. So that would mean anything from the revolutionary leftists would probably side with a larger group that you could roughly call the social democrats, or sort of the Bernie types, the types of people that revolutionary leftists and tankies like to call unradicalized libs. And then there's all other sorts of groups that go along with that. And then, I think the milquetoast room temperature conservatives would probably pair up with, other more radical right-wing groups. And it's difficult to say because in a lot of these radical groups, both on the right and the left, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the feds, the FBI, insert your favorite three-letter acronym, federal group, they tend to infiltrate these groups and try to create these artificial incidents where something bad happens, somebody gets killed, and it's more or less the government trying to retain its power and popularity over any other political alternative. So I think they've done that quite well over the last 6 or 7 years, just in relation to our present political age. And so when in terms of a battle map, what would that look like? Well, I think actual fighting, actual combat would be that would just be more or less confined to cities and industrial centers. Like, it's hard for me to imagine huge battles or tank battles somewhere in central Montana, or things like that. Or, and battles would also be retained around or confined around U.S. military bases, ports, things like that. And Todd, you brought up a point a while ago, and there's been several articles to substantiate this, but in Germany, there's been these occasional crackdowns on so-called right-wing extremists in the German government, or in the German military, specifically in the Bundeswehr, the army. And when I've dug into this a little bit, the so-called extremists are guys who proudly actually sing the words to the German national anthem, whereas much of the German public they'll simply hum it at at soccer games, or it's not like they have 3D printed busts of Hitler in their in their closet or anything else like that. It's very, very it's what these guys that they're busting are basically almost like, but they're practically mainstream conservatives by American standards. And so your question with that was like, well, okay, well, if something happens and German sovereignty or territorial control is under question, well, who's going to who's going to fill out the ranks of the Bundeswehr in these highly understrength battalions and divisions and regiments? And no one else seems to be up to the task, especially culturally, than people who call themselves, so-called right wing. So and that's something I'll touch on here a little bit later in the roundtable.
So yeah, there's as far as his assessment of the resources the left has at its disposal, one of the things that he goes over quickly and doesn't really do it due diligence is the advantages in finance and technology that these urban centers, which presumably would lean left, would have. So, for example, if you're going to finance this conflict, I mean, we know which side Wall Street's going to go. And that's going to give that side a big head start in financing activities. And the other thing is drone warfare. I mean, it doesn't really, in one sense, it doesn't matter as much that the average left winger is a soy boy versus, some I don't know, some Chad farm guy from Kansas on the right. If you have a drone that can, fire, a missile at you, it doesn't really matter. And a lot of these people would be used to, gaming systems, and which is a pretty easy conversion over to a drone system, as well as any advanced hardware that could be maintained in combat over time. Obviously, it'd be difficult since it's a civil war in America that we're talking about in this context. They would have a slight advantage there as well. But, I mean, and the right would be more of an insurgent force. But again, we know how the U.S. handles insurgencies, and that very well, as we saw in Afghanistan. But also the idea that the left isn't going to put up a fight. I mean, which left? I mean, it's pretty clear that what if Alt-Hist isn't aware of Jackson Hinkle, Infrared Haas, or Caleb Maupin. This is a very serious left. Many of them have serious, tough guys. I mean, if you go into a bar fight with like Jackson and Haas, you're good. Like these are tough dudes. And so there are tough dudes on the left. They're not the kind of woke left that he's talking about. Furthermore, if you want to talk about like liberal left, the Pacific Northwest is generally very liberal left, but they also have a very active outdoor culture, which also means a very active gun culture. So I have a friend that lives up in the Pacific Northwest, and he says, yeah, all these liberals love guns. And they're liberals. They vote liberal. They, do all the sort of stuff you'd expect in the Pacific Northwest. But they also like guns. Colorado, too. So, okay, they're not, Haas isn't woke. These liberals in the Pacific Northwest may or may not be woke. But it's not necessarily the case that it's going to be some, skinny jean-wearing Antifa guys going up against Iraq war veterans. I mean, it's going to be different. You're not just going to have that. And of course there'll be infighting, right? We're seeing it now. The sort of like, I guess, tanky left or old left revival is being called fascist and attacked by the mainstream left. So how that pans out would be anyone's guess. I think the kind of left that would be a dominant political force, military force, would be this neo-communist left that we see developing, because it historically is. In civil wars and in revolutions, they tend to do very well because they're single-minded and ruthless. And in fact, what would likely happen is, if there was anything like a umbrella organization, and again, I think that might be a little too generous, it would look a lot like the Spanish Civil War, where the left-wing factions were just infighting, and the communists were trying to take over. And they did take over in order to have a unified front, but by that point, Franco had won too many decisive victories, and it was too late for the communists to do it. But if there's any left victory, it would be them. And on the right, there's going to be infighting too, libertarianism and individualism, and that is also going to make it difficult to organize directly. And again, the element of financing, again, which is crucial for waging a conflict like this, is going to be on the advantage of the urban side, because the urban side has all the banks and the financial connections. Their biggest challenge will be keeping, as you pointed out, Keith, the urban lumpen proletariat in check, because in a situation like that, the cities could just completely melt down, and you'd have to bring in draconian police state measures to keep the cities in control. I mean, to be honest, the communists themselves did this. You might just recruit these prisoners and send these lumpen proles and send them to the front. I mean, that's a pretty sensible thing to do. It's happened throughout history. And so I think that whoever he envisions the left to be could muster some military force. But then again, I think there'd be a lot of competing interests. In fact, I think the ideologies and interests that would start to win and take over parts of the country would be those that transcend the right and left. So, for example, I think it's pretty obvious that much of the Great Plains would fall under the influence of the Mormons. In fact, the Mormons went out west back in the 1840s to escape the U.S. because at that point it was still a part of Mexico. And they were working on building their own Mormon empire. So I think in anything, the Mormons would just take over. And rather than being a right versus left thing, even though the Mormons would be tacitly on the right, it would be more of like a Mormon religious fervor versus anything else. I think also geographic limits would contain conflict. So, everything west of the Rocky Mountains would be a sort of self-contained conflict zone, just like everything east of the Appalachians, north and south of the Mississippi River, north and south of the Ohio River, and then east and west of the Mississippi River would all be these sort of like self-contained conflict zones, where it would be difficult due to geography to break out from those areas. And if whatever remains of the federal government tried to remain strong everywhere, it would be strong nowhere. Keith.
Yeah, one problem that I see with a lot of these kinds of videos that talk about, well, what is the next civil war going to look like, is that I think they focus to too great a degree on some of these internet political factions, as well as these groups that are among the most visible in terms of street level confrontations between political groups, like the MAGA people and the Antifa and Proud Boys and groups like that. In a time of genuine breakdown of civil society, the thing that's going to lead to that would probably be fragmentation of the ruling class, fragmentation of the state, and fragmentation of the military. As long as that apparatus is intact, there's not going to be a civil war. I mean, there might be rebellions, but they'll be annihilated. And what's happening now in a lot of countries is we're starting to see ruling class fragmentation. I think it's pretty far along in America, but something similar has started to happen in Israel recently. Like if you've been following what's been going on in Israel, what you basically see is a fracturing of the ruling class between what might be their equivalent of our right wing, which is a coalition of populist, nationalist, and religious factions, and on one side, and then their deep state aligned with the left on the other side. It was recently revealed that the Mossad was actually fomenting mass protest against the right in Israel. And that's kind of what we see in the United States. We see the populist, nationalist, religious, etc., right on one end, and they tend to be the Republican base. And you've seen the left and the deep state align with each other. And when you see that kind of fragmentation in the ruling class is when a civil society starts to break down. As far as the military, someone I know who was in the military was telling me just yesterday that because he was not a Trumpophobe, that many of his former military colleagues stopped talking to him. He told me once before that the military is largely a combined affirmative action, welfare, and public works program, and that the real heavy lifting in the military is usually done either by the special forces or with technology or with foreign troops or with private contractors like Academy. And I think that the idea that the military is all a bunch of, blood and soil, or, faith, family, and flag conservatives is a really archaic view of the military. Most military people I know personally don't fit that description. Maybe some do, and maybe in certain units they do, but that's not generally the bulk of what you find among the rank and file military. There's a military base, very large one near where I live, and most of the people that I know who are from there, a lot of them are people of color, minorities. Some of them aren't even Americans. There some of them are from Georgia, the country Georgia, and Latin America and other places. So I don't really see that the military is going to rally behind the right wing in a civil war. I think at most, I think one of two things would happen. The military is going to decide with the dominant factions of the ruling class, which at this point are on the left, or they're going to side, or they're just going to fragment into warring factions. I don't really see the military as a right-wing force nowadays. Another issue is when it comes to civilian violence. One group that this guy doesn't talk about at all are organized crime and street gangs and stuff like that. In a genuine civil war, groups like MS-13 are going to be far more formidable than the Proud Boys and the Antifa and these LARPer clubs. The MS-13 is like ISIS. Like the MS-13 actually carried out a murder in my brother's neighborhood a couple of years ago, and this was a suburban neighborhood in a relatively small town, almost rural area. Right, that's how pervasive some of these groups are now, and there are probably tens of thousands of street gangs, and with over a million members in the United States. That's that's size-wise that matches the army. You've also seen those infiltrate the armed forces to some degree as well too, and that's just one example of organized crime. So when real civil wars start, you don't just see people fighting over policy preferences. You see all kinds of things that come out of that. All kinds of people with long-standing vendettas, retribution against long-standing enemies, all kinds of, every kind conceivable type of opportunism there is. So I think that the analysis of this video is limited in that respect as well. It's another thing too is what, like Swithin was saying, it underestimates how dependent the United States is on other countries for all kinds of important resources. And another issue is what would international reaction be to a civil war in the United States? Like, how would Europe respond to that? How would Japan respond to that? How would the Russians and the Chinese respond to that? Would they get involved in it? Would they start arming one side or another? Would they arm both sides at the same time? And as far as resources, would they cut off certain the shipments of resources to one side or another? Would they increase shipments to other sides? Would they, I think international interest would be a big player in that.
Agreed. Swithin.
With respect to how right-wing the American military is, that I had looked at some of the comments on the video, and they were agreeing basically with Keith that it's not the organization that it used to be, if it ever was, as sort of ideological as he makes out. I mean, the people I've come across in the military have basically just been people who didn't really have a huge amount of direction and just got a job there and thought they'd straighten things out. They're not necessarily hugely ideological at all. I talked to a guy recently who he was in the Marines. He was out in Afghanistan and various places. Not particularly political. It was just his job. He went out and did it. So I don't really think there's that massive pool to draw on as he claims. And also in England, in America, the efforts to diversify the military, especially in the top brass, who are just all obvious progressive types, especially as well in England as well. They claim, which is true to a large extent, that basically the white working class population isn't as great as it used to be because birth rates are lower. So basically, you need to diversify the military intake, which of course is going to mean that, will probably mean a broadly speaking leftward shifting culture within the military for obvious reasons. Now, that said, in the US context, you've got to look at the veterans as potential troops as well. And the question then arises, how many of those are there? How active and useful would they be? And what proportion are they of relative to the current military? So that's something to consider. With respect to the economic power, I think, Todd, you're right. It was clear that Wall Street, etc., would back the left. Although it would be interesting to see how they would cope in an extreme situation like this. So as we've seen with the Silicon Valley Bank and First Republic, the banking sector is not hugely stable. And so if you had sufficient numbers of people withdrawing deposits, etc., you could cause a crash in the banking sector. Now, that would equally harm, in a way, the mid-America if they were trying to get finance for things. But it would somewhat significantly curtail the power of the coasts. Although I fully expect in any situation where this is likely to happen, the federal government would just declare bank holidays, immediately put capital controls on. Now, that would still stymie the amount of finance they were likely to create. I mean, that is still true. But Wall Street's power is fragile. And if that was to be pricked in a particular way, then things could become interesting with that. Keith's point on the international aspect is also interesting. I mean, who would anybody back? I mean, Europe would almost certainly back the left. The Japanese, everyone apart from the Japanese and everyone apart from the Chinese and Russia would certainly back the left. I mean, they're all part of the Anglosphere. It's all part of the upper middle class elite, the sort of transnational elite who all have the same sort of broad views on things. I mean, there are differences, of course, they're not uniform, but they're all broadly part of the same club. Unless, of course, some of them see it as a way of getting away from the yoke of sort of American imperialism, say in Japan, for instance. Maybe want to do that. You would possibly expect the Chinese and the Chinese and the Russians to support the right, just on the basis that it's not the left, and there'd be a way of bogging things down. Or I suppose the most politics thing to do would be to arm both sides. That said, though, the Chinese would be dependent on a lot of exports to America, so they want to keep those going because otherwise that'll be a financial trouble for them. Although saying that, I do think that Xi is trying to move away from a heavily export-based economy. So depending on what happens there in the medium term, is another issue. But yeah, just on the main thing on the finance. The finance is definitely a benefit, but it is fragile.
Okay, eternal philosophy.
Right. Well, just to riff off of Keith's point about gang warfare and the possibility of a second civil war, I think that's totally legitimate. And to add to that, I think the cartels that are just to the south of us, I think the cartels, I don't know who is aware and who isn't, but given all the money that they've accrued over the years, many of the cartel members have received a lot of military training and are uh, I would argue a very legitimate paramilitary force. And so I could see isolated cases where the cartel makes a grab for El Paso or something like that if the U.S. military industrial complex is fragmented and distracted, and other gang warfare in places like Los Angeles or Baltimore, Detroit, that would dominate much of the urban landscape rather than one paramilitary force versus another, or an establishment force versus the rebels. I think that would have to be taken into account. I think if a full-blown civil war really had ignited, a lot of cities would have their logistical systems completely disrupted. And so if the grocery stores are beginning to empty quickly and gas station lines are just as long as you can imagine, then that would also trigger a huge exodus from a lot of these city centers. And so that would create all sorts of I don't know, issues of travel and unique levels of desperation that you really haven't seen in America in a really long time. Um, and I can't remember who said it earlier, but if war was to happen, you have to remember too that war is very much a financial thing, and if there was enough of a split amongst the ruling class about what should be done with the United States in terms of a long-term political vision, um, I would imagine things like with what happened in Canada, for example, when a lot of the trucker protests had some of their bank accounts frozen. I can imagine other events like that taking place, where if one particular group of banks is held under a certain ideological position and vice versa, I could see a lot of digital banking trickery and things like that going against certain people. So it's difficult to think of this as just strictly a fighting war. It has all these other categories, like there's a whole digital and cyber aspect to it. There'd be a whole cultural aspect to it. Um, and I agree with everyone's statement earlier that the U.S. military isn't some sort of blood and soil right wing uh, type of a culture anymore. There really is no unifying culture in the United States anymore. There's no um, centralizing North Star to which the majority of us all agree upon. We're just sort of these hyper individualists that rely on the economy to fuel our hobbies, and everything else is dealt by a completely different invisible class that's far and above beyond us all. So if that ruling class shatters, and then that trickles down to the modern person, well then that will have meant at that point that the logistical severity of the situation is so extreme that rather than people automatically waking up and deciding, oh well, I'm going to team up with Hawes's folks, or I'm going to team up with the Proud Boys, or I'm going to team up with X, Y, and Z. I think what would happen, again, it's my belief that if a civil war were to happen, then the food and water supplies and things like that could come into question very easily. And so what will happen is most people will sort of form communities, and instead of like large scale cities being a unified sociological thing, it most likely be the suburbs or towns life would become much more local, and any external threat, whether that be right wing, left wing, or any other type of entity, that's when you would see conflict. And I think that's sort of a complicated gray area that would be difficult to keep good track of during such a chaotic and complicated civil war.
So yeah, one of the problems, I guess the main criticism that we're all sort of converging on is that what if all this is assuming a degree of coherency and that doesn't really exist in America anymore, not just for America as a whole, but even between right and left. I think that the dominant feature of an American Civil War would be fission, things just continuing to fragment apart, because that just seems to be the overarching driving spirit of America today. And it would take something radically new and different that we haven't seen yet, I believe, to reverse that course. So I think if you view America as Humpty Dumpty and the Civil War as Humpty Dumpty falling off the wall, maybe no one can put them back together again. So that's sort of what I'm thinking at this point. Once, because it was mentioned that the U.S. military-industrial complex is all over the country. Yes, which means that in a time of domestic war, it would break down. There's no way that you could produce large-scale modern weapons with the way all this is distributed across the country if the whole country is in a conflict zone, right? It's not like in the American Civil War where industry was all concentrated up in the north, right? It's all over the country. So I think that would lead to a collapse in armaments production, which would entail the need for imports, which again, we've sort of hinted at that. I think also any nation sympathetic to America, to the American left, the establishment, wouldn't be able to do anything because China would attack all the Pacific Rim countries. The Arabs would probably attack Israel, and Russia would keep Europe distracted. And so I don't think they'd really be able to do anything, to be honest. And because the reason why these countries don't attack their neighbors right now is because, well, the U.S. is backing them up. But if the U.S. isn't able to do that, I think that creates a whole different situation. And this process of fission, I think, would eventually end, and then there would be regional powers based on the geographic limitations that I mentioned earlier, because the amount of political and economic and military power necessary to project power beyond these geographic cul-de-sacs, so to speak, wouldn't really be there. After all, the Civil War just happened. So that's sort of what I think would be the case. Keith Preston.
Yeah, I think an issue with the video is that the speaker overestimates the role of ideology as opposed to other considerations. Like I think Terminal was saying, if a civil war starts, people aren't going to pick their side based on which internet YouTube channel they like the best. They're going to go for who's got the food, who's got the water, who's got the fuel, who's got the electricity. Those kinds of things are what most people think about during a time of serious crisis or breakdown of social order or civil war or any of that kind of stuff. And that's going to be a principal determinant. Most people care first and foremost about security. Whoever is able to provide security. For instance, if we had a breakdown in the cities where we have massive looting and rioting, and it becomes Escape from New York or Clockwork Orange or something like that, whoever is able to provide security is going to have a lot of people rally behind them, and it doesn't matter what their philosophy is or ideology is. People are going to go by, well, okay, as long as these folks are in charge, I can go walk down the street without getting attacked. That's how normies think. And normies think about, okay, where am I going to get food? Like the grocery store has no more food because the shipping lanes or whatever got shut off, the truck routes got shut off. So where am I going to get food? So whoever is able to provide food, they're the ones that are going to get the greatest amount of support. These kinds of logistical factors. Who has electricity? If my community has electricity and yours doesn't, there's a lot of people are going to want to come over to my side. So and then that shifts over time too. One group can be dominant for a while, they can then yield to another group, and then the new group that's better able to provide these kinds of needs, they are able to win a greater degree of loyalty. That's why in revolutions you constantly see a series of coups, like France in the French Revolution was a good example. You had one group that came to power, then they were put out and replaced by another one, then another one, and then in Russia you had the February Revolution and then the October Revolution. And that's very common in revolutionary situations. One group stays in power only for a while and they're put out. Or in civil war, not a revolution but civil war, it's the same way. You have different places fragment into different factions. I mean, even during the U.S. Civil War, you had localities in the South that were trying to secede from the Confederacy. You also have to consider the other, like I was talking about, gangs and all of that. During the American Civil War, you had American Indian nations on both sides of that. You would probably find a lot of criminal elements in today that is people who are outside the standard left-right paradigm, blue tribe, whatever, red tribe paradigms. You would find people outside of that throwing their loyalty in based on what's going to benefit their own group, which is not necessarily connected to those interests, and also just sheer opportunism, like I was saying before about organized crime or just individuals generally. You always see those kinds of things in Civil War.
All right, Swithin.
With respect to your point, Todd, about what you think all the Arabs would invade Israelis, and you would expect sort of fragmentation of geopolitical order, I think that is possible to some extent, although I think possibly more likely is Israel invades the Arabs. More than that, I actually think the Americans restrain the Israelis to a large extent. I think they would be significantly more violent with their neighbors than they currently are. Also, you got to remember as well that they've got a decent deal with the Saudis at the moment. Now, they don't see eye to eye theologically, but if it's business, that could stay. As well, obviously, Israel needs some oil, so it's always handy to get them from a particular source. And I mean, you I don't know. I think probably more of the case the Saudis hate the Iranians more than they hate the Israelis. Now, with respect to the civil war and not being able to get food and stuff, I mean that's possibly that could well happen, and the supply chains would be disrupted to a large extent. But I mean, if you take Ukraine currently, I know a number of people who live there. Now I know it's not a civil war, but I mean a lot of stuff is just carrying on as normal. Now, granted, they're not in the east, so that's where the fighting is. But again, unless I think it's going to depend on the specific situations, but unless there's fighting like literally everywhere, I'm pretty confident that the supply chains will, to a large extent, continue, even though they will be significantly interfered with. Now, clearly, you could say, well, what's going to happen to the trade routes from, say, East Asia to the USA? But again, I think the Chinese, amongst others, have an interest in keeping them going, as do the Japanese, because I believe, yes, both Japan and China have a trade surplus, so they're going to be interested in keeping that going for financial purposes. So all I would say here is the economy is significantly more robust than people might think when it comes to actually getting stuff produced. Now, you could say, well, what about the financial sector? Am I contradicting myself? Well, I think the financial sector is a particular special case, just given the nature of the way it runs with central banks, etc., that it is particularly fragile. But a lot of the other sort of bricks and mortar stuff tends to keep going. I wouldn't. Now, will there be will the shortage? Yes. Will there be, do other stuff? Yes, quite possibly. But I don't think it's going to be quite as bad as you might think. That's all my point would be there.
Okay, turn to philosophy.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Swithin's last point there. I don't know if it would be as bad as a lot of people like to think it would be. I think the way I see things playing out is far less sexy compared to something like Escape from New York or some type of apocalyptic AAA Hollywood movie. Yeah, again, most people in the United States and most middle class people of the modern world just are simply not ideologically motivated. I think most people would just simply team up with their bloc in the vast stretches that make up suburban America. And this is just out of convenience and in the interests of simply surviving. I think you would absolutely have some isolated events where one ideologically motivated group attacks another for any number of reasons in specific locations, whether that's in cities or at industrial centers. You might see some sabotage, a couple of instances of industrial or infrastructural sabotage by certain groups. And just a note on the the international response to that, I tend to agree with Swithin too that there would probably be a legitimate push from the Israelis into Western Syria, and I don't know what that would look like exactly, but not many people seem to pay attention to this, but the Syrian civil war is still definitely an ongoing conflict, and you'd probably see Turkey push down into Syria from the south and team up with the Kurds to some extent. I don't know. The Kurds and the Turks have sort of had this on again, off again military relationship as of the last few years. So that's very difficult to forecast as well. I think the shipping routes across the oceans, I think in the interest of business and making money and keeping things going, I think those would actually be probably maintained. But in the aftermath of such an event, if there was no unified United States anymore, then you'd have sort of these regional powers that would look something like, I don't know, like Cascadia or the West Coast or the Great Basin region or the Great Lakes region or something like that. But I think most people are just simply not ideologically motivated. Things would have to get very, very desperate in terms of resources for people to, leave their recliner couches and get up and do something if it meant keeping themselves or their family or their friends alive. And so that's where, these levels of desperation we're seeing in the interwar period in Germany. And, it's not like these things take time. It takes, well, I won't say it takes a long time for things to get bad, but things have to be quite bad in the first place for the normal apolitical person to get up and do something and join a cause, much of which he or she isn't fully aware of what that cause is all about. So I don't know. Those are my closing remarks.
All right. Well, I'll say for my closing remarks, it's while we were somewhat critical of what I thought his take, it's not meant to be an attack on him. I mean, he's definitely one of the few people that does, I think, attempted to do serious analysis and research of current events, which is in part why we did this today in the first place. Final thoughts, Keith?
Yeah, the question of whether there's actually going to be a civil war is an interesting one. I think that for that to happen, there would have to be something along the lines of a very severe economic downturn, which could happen. I mean, we could have a depression or something like that. But I have a hard time with the idea that a society where being overweight is the norm is going to be a society where people actually fight a civil war. I mean, what are they going to do? Throw donuts at each other or something? It's so I think I used to think years ago that there was going to be another civil war. Over time, I started becoming more skeptical of that. After some of the things that have happened recently, like the riots in 2020 and J6, I've become less skeptical, but still remain skeptical. But we'll see.
All right, final thoughts with.
Olpitz's video is interesting. It's worth watching if you haven't done it. My criticisms aren't meant to put him down. I mean, he's put a decent amount of work into there, and it's worth discussing. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to have the conversations we had here. So, as Keith says, what would precipitate a civil war? I think the economic thing is the most likely. And as I said, with the banking sector and stuff, that is possible. But again, the economy seems to be robust. The fundamental markets tend to try and get themselves produce stuff that people want to buy. So, I mean, in a way, you could say, the economy's recovered reasonably well from lockdowns as best as you could consider. I mean, the supply chains kept going, so and that's when everyone shut everything down. So, but yes, of course, it could happen. That's all I've got.
All right. Thank you again, Keith Preston, Terminal Philosophy, Swift and Dobson. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.